The Texas sun has a way of bleaching the land into silence. Long highways, dust that never settles, heat that bends the horizon until nothing looks real. But for decades, one man moved through this landscape as if he belonged to it, a quiet, relentless figure whose name carried weight long before the world ever heard of Bonnie and Clyde. His name was Frank Hammer. To some, he was a hero. To others, a weapon. To everyone, he was unforgettable. This is the story of the cowboy who rode 90 miles to save a town and later walked into history as the man who ended the reign of Bonnie and Clyde. But that ending began long before the bullets. It began with a boy, a horse, and a land that demanded hardness from anyone who hoped to survive it. Frank Hammer grew up in Texas in the late 1800s, a world where justice often moved slower than trouble. He wasn't born into influence. He didn't finish school. He didn't come from money. What he did have was something rarer, a sense for danger, and an almost impossible tolerance for pain. He worked ranches, repaired fences, and spent long days alone on horseback, days where the wind was the only voice and tracks in the dirt were the only language. That solitude shaped him. He learned to read trails the way others read books. He learned that people lied, but footprints didn't. He learned that hesitation was the difference between living and dying. By the time he was 21, he had already stopped a horse thief single-handedly, rescued a kidnapped boy, and tracked a murderer across 6 counties. That's when the Texas Rangers found him. They didn't recruit him for his charm. They recruited him for his accuracy with a rifle, with his instincts, and with his judgment. Frank joined the Rangers during a time when the badge wasn't a job, it was a battlefield. There were cattle thieves, train robbers, gunmen who vanished into the brush, gangs that lived along the border, feuds that had lasted for generations, and when all diplomacy failed, which it often did, someone had to ride out alone. Frank did that more than anyone. The incident that turned him into a legend happened in 1906. A small Texas border town sent a desperate message to Ranger headquarters: "We need help. The mob is coming." A feud had erupted. Families had armed themselves. Rumors spread that dozens of men were preparing to storm the jail, to lynch a prisoner before morning. Most Rangers were days away. No one could possibly arrive in time, except one, Frank Hammer. He saddled his horse, slung a Winchester rifle across his back, and began riding, not on roads, not between towns, but straight across open country through brush, ravines, hills, and heat so merciless it could peel skin. 90 miles in under a day, on one horse, with no sleep. When he arrived, the town was simmering with tension. The sheriff was terrified. The mob was gathering on the street. The prisoner was praying. Frank walked out into the street alone. Just one man, no backup. He stood between the jailhouse and the angry mob, lifted his rifle, and spoke with a calmness that chilled the crowd more than any threat. "You will go home now," he said, "or you'll deal with me first." No shouting, no speeches, just absolute certainty. The kind that comes from a man who has already decided he will die before he moves. The mob dispersed. No shots were fired. The prisoner lived, and the legend of Frank Hammer began to grow. Frank wasn't just brave, he was methodical. He memorized people the way detectives memorize crime scenes. He studied motives, patterns, and weaknesses. He once tracked a killer by noting that the man walked with a slight tilt and correctly predicted which creek crossing he would choose to favor his injured leg. This wasn't guesswork. It was a deep understanding of human nature, forged in the wild. He survived ambushes, knife fights, gunfights that would have killed lesser men. In one attack, he was shot multiple times. Doctors told him he'd need 6 months to recover. He was back on duty in 3 weeks. But he wasn't reckless. He hated corruption more fiercely than he hated criminals. He intervened when sheriffs abused their power. He stopped lynchings. He protected innocents, even when it meant confronting other officers. For years, that was his life. A quiet war fought in the dust. And for years, that was enough. Until a new kind of outlaw appeared. One the country had never seen before. By 1934, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were not just criminals, they were folklore. Newspapers romanticized them. Their photos glamorized them. Crowds whispered their names with a mix of fear and fascination. But behind the myth was a brutal reality. They robbed banks. They stole cars. They killed police officers and civilians without hesitation. They left a trail of bodies behind them, like punctuation marks in a bloody story. The entire country was humiliated. Local police departments were outgunned. The FBI was still in its infancy and struggling to keep up. Morale was collapsing. The governor of Texas needed someone who could end the reign of Bonnie and Clyde, not symbolically, not politically, but permanently. There was only one name that made sense. Frank Hammer. Hammer, who had since retired from the Rangers, was pulled back into service for this one last job. He didn't rush. He didn't form a posse. He didn't chase headlines. While everyone else was obsessed with the romantic photographs of the couple, he studied Clyde Barrow, his habits, his driving patterns, his childhood roots, his preferred hideouts. He tried to understand how Clyde thought, how he ran. He traced Clyde's movements across 5 states, mapping them out like constellations. And then he realized something critical. Clyde didn't choose his hideouts randomly. He followed patterns, emotional ones. He returned to familiar roads, familiar safe houses, familiar drop spots for messages. He was a creature of habit and patterns of vulnerabilities. Frank began predicting where he would go next. For weeks, he shadowed the gang, never too close, never too far, always just beyond their line of sight. Bonnie and Clyde had survived for years because they were fast and reckless, but Frank wasn't trying to be fast. He was trying to be inevitable. On May 23, 1934, Hammer positioned himself alongside a rural road in Louisiana. It was a place Clyde couldn't resist. A friend of the gang had been arrested nearby, and Clyde was known to attempt rescues of his associates. Frank knew he wouldn't be able to help himself. The morning was quiet. Birds chirped in the trees. Mist hung low over the road. Frank waited with 5 other officers, all handpicked for their discipline and marksmanship. They weren't there to negotiate. They weren't there to issue a warning. They were there to end a chapter that had left dozens dead. At 9:15 a.m., a V8 Ford approached, just as they'd anticipated. Dust trailing behind it, engine humming, exactly as predicted. Frank stepped out from the brush and raised his hand, a signal to stop. The car hesitated, just for a second. A single heartbeat. Then Clyde reached for his weapon. Frank fired first. The ambush lasted seconds, shorter than a breath, louder than thunder. When the dust settled, Bonnie and Clyde were gone. The myth ended in silence, and Frank Hammer walked back into the trees. Not triumphant, not proud, just tired, because for him, justice never felt like victory. It felt like work that had finally been completed. Frank retired with no speeches, no celebrations, no demands. He refused interviews. He refused publicity. He refused to explain himself to a world that wanted heroes more than truth. He believed justice should be quiet. The newspapers called him brutal. The outlaws feared him. Historians debated him. But the people who knew him, they said something simpler. He carried the burden so others wouldn't have to. Frank Hammer died in 1955. But the stories didn't. The 90-mile ride, the countless shootouts, the man who tracked shadows across 5 states, the ranger who didn't chase for only justice, and the cowboy who ended the most famous criminal partnership in American history. He was flawed, human, hard, uncompromising. But in a world where legends are often exaggerated, Frank Hammer didn't need exaggeration. The truth was enough. Most heroes never call themselves heroes. Frank Hammer certainly never did. He didn't ride 90 miles for glory. He didn't track Bonnie and Clyde for fame. He didn't fight gunmen for admiration. He did it because someone had to. Because if he didn't ride into danger, no one else would. When people talk about the Old West, they imagine cowboys on posters. But the real West was built on men who rode into the heat alone and stood between danger and the people who couldn't defend themselves. Frank Hammer wasn't perfect, but he was there every time someone needed him. And that's what turns a man into a legend. Not the bullets, not the headlines, not the stories, but the moments when he rode alone, into the dust, into the heat, into the danger, because someone had to. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating figures. See you next time.